Hi, so we're picking up with Pirkei Avot, and we are in chapter 4, and we're on Mishnah number 14. If you've got a Shabbat Siddur, it's on 249 at the very bottom, and any copy of Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, Mishnah number 14. So we start with Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, Yochanan the sandler, the shoemaker. What's interesting about that title is we've seen more than once or twice or three times perhaps the whole notion that rabbis were not supposed to be professional rabbis, that they were supposed to have regular jobs, and Torah was something that they did not as a vocation, but an avocation. So here, the fact that Yochanan is known as the sandal maker tells us a great deal that there were rabbis who indeed lived out that ideal. And he was known for, during the day, his day job was fixing shoes. And the rest of the time he spent with Torah. So he tells us the following: Kol Knesiyah. The word Knesiyah, from the word, same word as kenes or kinus, or Beit Knesset, something to do with assembly. In modern Hebrew, when we use the word Knesiyah, it's often used as a kind of, as a church. Beit Knesset, house of assembly, is the Hebrew word for a synagogue. Kol and a kinus in youth groups or in other organizations is simply a gathering of the membership. So Kol Knesiyah, any assembly. Shehi, which is L'Shem Shamayim, for the name, for the sake, for the purpose of heaven. Sofa Lehidkayim. In the end, or its destiny, is that it will exist, it will survive, it will thrive, it will continue. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim, but any organization, any meaning, any gathering of people, she'ena l'shem shamayim, which isn't for the sake of heaven, ein sofa lehidkayim, it is not destined to survive in the end. So the key concept here becomes, what is L'Shem Shamayim? Literally, L'Shem, for the name of, for the purpose of, Shamayim, heaven, another way of saying for God, right? So any gathering of people that is not a godly gathering or for done for the sake of God, is not going to eventually survive. And I think we have to understand this beyond just the narrow range of just religious things, okay? So let's talk for a minute, though, about religion. There are many religious things, organizations, assemblies, even services, even synagogues, right, which gather and are really not l'shem shamayim. Ultimately, they're not for the sake of God, for the sake of heaven. Think about a synagogue that people come together and it's rife with politics and it's just not a nice place, and maybe it's run by a certain clique of people, or maybe there's a sense that this is about money, and if you can't afford, you don't belong here. Or imagine even on a Shabbos service, Imagine that, who are the people who get aliyahs? Well, you got to know somebody. You got to be friends of the in-group, or you got to be a big donator, right? Otherwise, forget it. If you're just a simple person who's there, maybe volunteers, maybe works hard, always is in attendance, you don't count. What counts are the people with power, the people with money. So that kind of shul, we're told, because that, even though they're there to pray to God, that's really not a shul. That's l'shem shamayim, for the sake of God, for the sake of godliness. They're there for all the wrong reasons. If people, if there's cliques in a shul, and this group doesn't like that group, and they fight among themselves, we're being told that's not a good thing. What would apply to a shul would certainly apply, if we, broaden that circle a little bit, to the realm of a learning institution, to a school, to a yeshiva. We can imagine that there might be a place where people supposedly come to learn Torah, but either the guy in charge, the Rebbe, the principal, whatever, it's really, it's about beating people down. It's about power. It's about you do what I say because I say it. If that's really what's involved, we're told that school, that yeshiva, that's not proper. And ultimately, it's not going to survive. And now let's broaden the circle even more, and let's go outside of the realm of religion. And let's assume that when we're talking about a Knessia, an assembly, it doesn't have to be involved with religion. So think about all the organizations that we belong to that are not involved with religion, based in religion, whether they're political or social or educational, all of those things, it's still possible to be l'shem shamayim, for a heavenly purpose, a godly purpose, even if it's not about God, and even if it's not about religion. So we wonder, about a government, for instance, secular government. Why are people there? We could question today the whole political world that we live in, and ask those people who are involved in governing, ask them, what's your ultimate motivation? Why are you here? Is it to serve the people? I've dedicated my life to public service because I believe in tikkun olam. I believe in making the world a better place. I want to help people in terms of people who need health care or people who are poor. How do we best help them? And while there might be many different answers to those questions, is somebody enter the realm of public service because they want to serve the public, or are they using that to further some other selfish, much more narrow agenda, right? And we wonder, is it about power? Is it about fame? Is it about money? Right. So those become the questions. And every time an election comes up, perhaps it's important for us to ask, not just what are the issues and where does this person stand on the issues, but maybe a second question, which is, why are you doing this? Why are you running? What is your motivation? What do you have in mind? What are you trying to accomplish and why? Very important questions for us to ask about the people who ultimately become our leaders. So we move on, and we see in chapter 4, Mishnah Tet Vav, Mishnah 15, We're told Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua Omer, by Elazar son of Shamua, used to say, Yehi chavod talmidach, may the honor, the dignity of your student be chaviv alecha, be as dear to you as kishalach, as your own dignity and honor. So many times in Pirkei Avot, we see the notion about find a rabbi, how to treat your teacher, how to behave towards them. Here, Rabbi Elazar is sort of flipping it, and he's reminding, he's admonishing, he's teaching the teachers how to deal with their students. Sometimes, I'm sure we've all, experienced it. Sometimes we can sense that we have a teacher who truly loves his or her students. And sometimes we sense that the teacher, the professor, may disdain, may hate our guts of the students. That they're there because it's a job. They're there because they want to do something more important than teach students. They want to do research. They want to write their next book, right? And the cost for them to do that is they need to teach a couple of classes. We probably all had those kind of professors in college. Well, here, Rabbi Elazar is saying you have to make sure that you treat your students with a sense of dignity, right? And that notion of the teacher, the professor, who has the incredibly high standards, and if you don't reach those standards, then you will be destroyed by that professor in public. So here, an important caveat about being a teacher. And then we're also told, uchevod chaverach, and if you're a student, the honor of your chaver. Chaver in modern Hebrew means friend. But in rabbinic Hebrew, the concept of a chaver was a study partner. And remember, our image of the Western image of studying is you go to the library, you sit with the books, and you read and you study on your own. In the traditional Jewish concept, you don't study on your own. You always study with a chaver, with somebody, chaver from the root word, which means to be joined together, somebody that you're connected with. And they're there to challenge, to help one another. So if you're in that position of studying with somebody, you should make sure that they're kavod, that they respect, that you show somebody who's a peer, who's your colleague, who's maybe your friend, but your study partner should be as dear to you as the morah of your rabbach, as the awe that you hold your rebbe in, that you hold for your teacher, right? So you may say, well, me and this guy were on an equal basis. He says something stupid, I'm going to let him know. Why are you dragging me down? Why aren't you giving me more of what I need? No, you need to have incredible respect and bring out the dignity of somebody who's on your level. And finally, morah rabach. If you are the student, the awe of your rabbi, of your teacher, should be kemorah shamayim, should be like the awe that you have for heaven, meaning for God. So notice all the relationships here. Teacher to student, student to student, student to rabbi, right? And all three of those should be in such a way that you have respect for somebody who's either below you or on par with you, and awe for somebody who is above you. And again, even though it's a rather striking statement, it represents the traditional Jewish view of learning, that your Rebbe, your teacher, is on the level of God, right? The same awe. And here it's not you should respect your teacher. It's you should be in awe of your teacher. A much different notion than the teacher needs to bring out the dignity of the student, but the student has to treat the teacher with a sense of awe, much greater than just respect. We move on. We're in Mishnah Tet Zayin, Mishnah number 16. Rabbi Yehuda says, Havei Zahir b'Talmud. You have to be very careful with study. Talmud here meaning not the Talmud, the book, but in more general sense, with all learning. Why? Shgiat Talmud, a mistake that you might make in learning, ola zadon, becomes a deliberate sin. So notice the differentiation between two categories of sins. One is a mistake that you made by mistake, inadvertently, right? But then there's a higher, worse category, which is a mistake, you know it's wrong, but nevertheless, you go out and you do it. My intention was to break the law. My intention was to do something that's inappropriate, right? That's considered much worse than, I wasn't aware that was wrong. Oh my God, what have I done, right? So we would assume you've got these two levels, that if somebody is malicious and is going to go out and is going to violate something, the law, whatever, that's much worse than somebody who makes a mistake. But here, Rabbi Yehuda is again admonishing and warning teachers how critical is your role. And the idea is that if you do something by mistake, let's say you're teaching a law and you make a mistake, a slip of the tongue, or you forgot, right? And you said one thing when you meant the other. You had no malicious intent in mind. And yet, what happens? The students who hear this, they're being told that X is what we do. X is permitted. X is acceptable. What you meant to say, and you had a slip of the tongue, is that X is wrong, Y is acceptable. But it came out wrong. You weren't thinking, right? You just made a mistake. In the meantime, the students hear X is acceptable, when the truth is X is wrong. It's a sin. So that's what they're going to leave the classroom with. You made a simple shkia, a mistake, a shkaga, unintentional, but now when they're going to go out, they're going to actually do X on purpose because of you, because of your mistake. They're now going to go into this higher category. So what is this really telling us? How critical it is for a teacher to be careful in teaching, right? And that every single word that you say, you have to be careful with. And, we can certainly imagine a teacher, let's say you're teaching 6, 7 periods a day, and first period you're sharp, and by eighth period, maybe you're drifting and you're falling asleep and your mind isn't sharp and the kids have just worn you down after all the teaching and all the other things that you had to deal with, and maybe you make a mistake. So look, it's one thing if you, eighth period, you make a mistake and then the kid goes and, well, this is what my teacher told me. And then on the SATs, they fill it out and they don't get a 1600. Worse things have happened in the history of the world. But from the rabbinic point of view, when we're talking about issues not about facts, but we're talking about issues of right and wrong, about permitted and forbidden. That's the incredible burden it is to be a teacher and to make sure that you're conveying the right material and that your slip, your being not so sharp doesn't translate into students making mistakes. And let's just remember a little bit of the context of this. It's not just a theoretical principle. When, with the destruction of the temple in 70, and Judaism had to be recreated for a whole new generation, you had a whole generation that perhaps was wiped out. And now Judaism is being rebuilt. And we now have to find new students and to teach them and to recreate what we had before. And when rabbinic teachings were initially not written, but were oral and were memorized, how much the more so is it critical at that point when what's at stake is not just what one person gets on the SAT, but whether a person is doing something that is wrong in the eyes of God. It's your fault if you made the mistake and taught the wrong thing. And on a deeper level, if you teach the wrong thing, then is there any hope and any future for the new Judaism that we're trying to recreate and to move forward into the future? Next Mishnah, Yud Zayin. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Here's one of the interesting things. You often see that in rabbinic literature, but you'll find it in the Bible as well. And you'll find it probably outside the Jewish world. The statement itself is a kind of a contradiction. So he starts this way. Shlosha ketarim hein. There are 3 crowns. So think about a keter. The crown on the Torah we call a keter Torah. Maybe you've seen in some organizations they'll refer to the Keter Award, right? Certain people are given an honor, and that category, or maybe it's how much money you've donated, right? So that's a keter, a crown. And we're told there are 3 crowns, 3 things that set you above and apart. What are those 3 things? First one is Keter Torah, the crown of Torah. So if you're an ordinary Jew, right, one way that you can become extraordinary is if you wear the crown of Torah. What does it mean to wear the crown of Torah? To become a scholar, to become a chacham, a wise sage, to become perhaps a rabbi, a rabbi. So that's the first one. By the way, the question is an interesting one. Is that open to everybody? I'm not sure that it is. Technically, theoretically, anybody could become a scholar. But you know what? You need to have, number one, you need to have some kind of mental capabilities. There are people who just are not able to reach that level, whether it's a college degree, a master's degree, a doctorate, right? It requires a certain level of intellectual capability, which maybe on one level, everybody could get there. But we all know that there's some people who just don't have that capability. And maybe it's not even their intellectual abilities. Maybe it's, I don't have time. Maybe I need to make a living. I need to work. I have family I need to take care of. So while they may be smart enough to get a doctorate, I don't have the luxury, the leisure to spend in classrooms, to spend in libraries, to spend learning and writing, right? So Keter Torah, the crown of Torah, theoretically is open to everybody, but I'm not sure if it in reality is. So that's the first one. The second one, Keter Kehuna, the crown of the priesthood. In other words, you could be a great rabbi, right? Or you could be a Kohen. You could serve in the temple. We're going back pre the year 70, while the temple was still in existence. And you can imagine that to be a Kohen carried with it certain prestige and certain honor. People would look up to the Kohen. The Kohen was able to enter the sanctuary and offer sacrifices. Common people couldn't do that. This was pretty special. So here we're told that there is Keter Kehuna. But as we all know, that not everybody can become a Kohen. One of the classic Jewish jokes is a guy comes to the rabbi and says, I would like to be a Kohen. The rabbi says, you can't like to become a Kohen. I'm sorry, it's not open for people to become a Kohen. And the man says, no, it's important to me, I have to be a Kohen. Rabbi says, nothing I can do. Sorry. It just doesn't work that way. Man says, what if I give the synagogue a donation of $1,000? Could you make me a Kohen? Rabbi says, what are you giving me this foolishness for? It doesn't work that way. Man says, I will give the synagogue $1,000 and I'll give you personally $1,000 if you make me a Kohen. Well, the rabbi gives in and says, well, I didn't realize it was so important to you, and sure, I will make you a Kohen. But first tell me, why is this so critical to you? You know, why are you willing to spend so much money in order to become a Kohen? Why? And the man says, well, my father was a Kohen, and his father was a Kohen, and I want to be a Kohen. Little did the man know, of course, that if your father is a Kohen, you're automatically a Kohen. So who becomes a Kohen? The Kohanim are a subset of the tribe of Levi. All the people in that tribe became the Levites. Part of that tribe of the Levites be those people who were immediately descended from Aaron and his children and their children. That's who the Kohanim were. So anybody who's a Kohen can basically trace their ancestry back to Aaron. How do you know if you're a Kohen? Well, you either know or you don't. If you don't know, then we assume you're not. And again, in your family, if your father, it works from father to son. If your father was a Kohen, then you're automatically a Kohen. What about if you're a girl and you grow up, and your father was a Kohen, and you're a woman, and you have children, are they Kohanim? No, it only works through the father. So religion works through your mother, but your status works through your father. Sometimes in a family, if there is a gravestone, right? You could check a gravestone and see if it says after, in the Hebrew, after the name HaKohen, then you know the family is a Kohen. Sometimes you could check in somebody's ketubah that's also written there if they are a Kohen or not. But otherwise, there's no way really to determine. A number of years ago, they seemed to indicate that through genetics, you might be able to determine, after all, if this all goes back to Aaron, then there should be some kind of genetic code and marker for people that you might be able to determine genetically with a test if you are in that subset of the Levite tribe descended from Aaron. But as of yet, that hasn't been developed, and it's questionable whether, how correct that would ultimately be. So that's the second crown, the crown of the kahuna, right? People who are special above and beyond, Torah teachers, priests. And then there's the third one, which is Keter Malchut, the crown of kingship, right? Malchut from the word melech. And of course, traditionally in the Jewish world, a king was a descendant of David. We started off with the first king was King Saul, but he was killed, and then the kingship moved to David. And his son, Solomon, became the next king. His son, Rehoboam, became the king after him. So approximately from the year 1000 BCE down to approximately 600 BCE, for more or less 400 years, the Jewish kings of Judah were people who were descended, could trace their ancestry all the way back to David. So that would be the third realm of a crown. And there it's literally a crown, somebody who was a king. Of course, after the destruction of the temple and there's no longer kings, we don't have Keter Malchut anymore, although there were people who were able and perhaps are still able to say that our family tradition is that I go all the way back to King David. By the way, one of the things with Christianity is the early Christians and the Gospels where it was critical to them to prove that Jesus was a descendant of King David. Therefore, he could be the Messiah, which means the anointed king of the Jews, because his descent was from David. And that's why it's important that as they're recreating the story of Jesus, they tell us who he was and who his parents were. And it's also important that he's born in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem is symbolically the birthplace of King David. Right? So that's why Jesus has to come out of Bethlehem as well, even though the family will later move to Nazareth up in the Galilee. He has to be born in Bethlehem. So here we're being told there are three kinds of crowns, three ways that a Jew could distinguish himself by his Torah knowledge, but that may not be open to everybody. By being a Kohen, but that certainly is not open to everybody. And by being a descendant of David, but that clearly is not open to everybody. So after Rabbi Shimon tells us that there are three crowns, he tells us, but the fourth crown is the most important one. So here we have this contradiction. There are three crowns. And then we find out, but there's a fourth. And the thing about the fourth crown is that unlike the first three, this one is open to anyone. So what is the fourth crown? The Keter Shem Tov, the crown of a good name. And we're told the Keter Shem Tov Oleh, the crown of a good name is higher. It goes up above Al Gabehen, above all the other three. Now, maybe you're not smart enough or you don't have the time to study. You can't become a scholar. Maybe you're not born into the family of the Kohanim. Maybe you're not descended from David. You're never going to be the Messiah. But anybody, everybody has the possibility of getting the fourth crown, which is Keter Shem Tov, of a good name, of a good reputation, right? And how do you get that? By being a mensch, right? If people are drawn by good deeds, right, and by kindness, those things are open to anybody. They don't require you being smart or rich or descended from any particular group or family. Everyone could have the Keter Shem Tov. Next Mishnah, Yud Chet, number 18. Rabbi Nehorai Omer. Nehorai is more of an Aramaic name, and it sort of means light in Aramaic. So here's an interest. We've seen rabbis with Greek names. We've seen rabbis with Hebrew names. And now with Rabbi Nehorai, we see a rabbi with an Aramaic name. Aramaic was the language. It's written in the same letters as Hebrew, but Aramaic becomes the language that's more spoken by the common people in the land of Israel, as well as in the land of Bavel in Babylonia. We have the Kaddish prayer that we recite, that everybody is familiar with. The Kaddish is actually in Aramaic. You wouldn't know it. Looks like Hebrew. To most people, sounds like Hebrew, but it's actually in Aramaic. The ability, if you know Hebrew, to know Aramaic, maybe, maybe not. It's sort of like, if you know French and Spanish and Italian, there are things that are similar. You might be able to figure them out. Doesn't mean that just because you know Spanish, you're fluent in Italian. But there is a similarity. They're all written in the same letters. Many words have similar roots, while there are some words that are different. So that's, the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic. Look, you could pick up Chaucer and try to read it, or even more difficult, Beowulf in the original, and you know the words. You could read the words, but a lot of them, and some of them are familiar, and some of them are just beyond you. What is this person saying? And yet, Chaucer is English. We speak English, so. There we find even Shakespeare, sometimes we have difficulty, and that goes back to, that's 400 years ago. Chaucer even more. So we see the difference. So Rabbi Nehorai, with his Aramaic name, Omer, Heve Goleh, you should choose, if you have a choice, rather to be exiled, L'makom Torah, to a place of Torah. V'al tomar, and don't say, shehi tavo acharecha. And don't say, you know what, I'm going to go to this place and Torah will eventually show up, right? I want to be there. And if there isn't Torah there now, it'll come. Don't worry about it. No. If you're going to go someplace else, pick yourself up from your home and go to another place, which is a kind of an exile. Maybe even it's a voluntary exile. You should always pick to go to a place of Torah. She'chaverecha yikamuha biadecha. Don't, right? It's only if you have other people, other chaverim, chaver, shechaverecha, only if you've got other people like you who are committed to Torah will you be able to establish their Torah. The el binatcha al tisha'ein, and don't think that you alone are able to do this on your own. I'm often thinking when people talk about moving, maybe in retirement, people talk about, where do I want to move to? And haven't we all heard people say, I'm going to Florida. I've had it with shoveling snow. Don't want to do that anymore. Can't deal with the cold weather. I want a place that's warm. And ultimately, people will say, okay, that's what I'm looking for. Getting away from the north, getting away from the cold, getting away from the snow. That becomes my number one priority. And then maybe you go there and you set up and you've got a gorgeous climate, certainly better than what you'll find up in the northeast. And then slowly you find out, can't get a good corned beef sandwich here. The bagels are terrible. And that's on the most superficial level. What happens on the deeper level? Is there a Jewish community that I want to be a part of? Is there a shul that I can go to with other people who care? Will we have for the holidays? Is there, will there be learning? Will there be Jewish observance? Will there be Jewish institutions besides a kosher food and a kosher butcher? Is there going to be a JCC where there's going to be social gatherings of Jews? Is there going to be, if you've got kids, is there going to be a synagogue for a Hebrew school or for a day school, for a yeshiva, right? So it's only afterwards that people then say, well, my main concern was about, I don't want to shovel anymore. And then ultimately you say, you know what, there were a lot of things back in the cold that we took for granted and that we sorely miss. What Rabbi Nehorai is telling us is that if you're going to move, that on the top of your list should be the issue of Torah, Makom Torah, a place of Torah in all its meanings, not just a place where there is a Torah and a shul, not only a place where there is teaching, Jewish study and learning and teaching, but Jewish values, if we could, broaden the word Torah to mean that as well, right? That becomes part of what you're looking for. So this idea of, where is home? In English, we say home is where the heart is. And perhaps what Rabbi Nehorai is saying is that home is where Jews are. Home is where Judaism is. Home is where Torah is. So don't be so quick to say climate is the most important thing. Whenever I talk to our seventh graders, our Zion class, right, one of the things that we talk about is that, and we come to the issue of driving on Shabbat, right, and creating a synagogue. And I say to them, when your parents were looking, to move into Jericho or whatever neighborhood, the top of their list was, number one, what's the school district like, right? We want to go to a good school district. And number two is, can we afford, the home? And it's not reversed, right? You're not necessarily going to move into Newcastle or Roosevelt because you can afford the home. and then afterwards say, well, let's see what the schools are like. Okay, so number one is for a priority for people in our community is the issue of what kind of school district is there. And I tell our kids, but in the Orthodox world, the number one question when people are looking to move is there an Orthodox shul in walking distance? Right? Because that becomes the number one priority. Now, it may very well be that Orthodox Jews aren't looking for the public schools, so it doesn't matter. Maybe they'll have to drive a little bit to get to the yeshiva or have a bus pick them up. But being in walking distance becomes the critical thing. So as they created first Levittown and then the other suburbs, including Jericho, the idea was nothing is in walking distance. Everything depends upon a car. And so Orthodox Jews, that they can't live that way. They need to be within walking distance of the synagogue, and they also need institutions not too far away from them, like a mikveh and like kosher food and like a yeshiva. Those become the critical things. And so it becomes understandable why the Orthodox have, in a sense, congealed into a few neighborhoods. So you've got places on the island, like the Five Towns, or like Great Neck or West Hempstead. And it's not too common to see Orthodox Jews in areas where there aren't conglomeration of other Orthodox Jews, because they all need, first and foremost, a makom Torah, a place of Torah, a shul for the Torah that they can walk to. That ultimately, of course, led to the difficulty within the conservative movement after prior to World War II, when people lived in Brooklyn or in smaller communities and in Brooklyn or the Bronx, you could walk pretty much. There was a synagogue, even a conservative synagogue, in walking distance to you. After World War II, GIs come back. They begin the need to create new places for new families, growing families. So Levittown and the suburbs are created. And the basis, of course, of the suburbs is the car, and you got to drive to everywhere. So what happened? You had conservative-leaning Jews who moved out to Long Island and buy homes because it was a good school district. They could afford the homes. And then, only then, did they then say, well, what are we going to do for the holidays? And now they found themselves, because this wasn't on their top priority list. So now they find themselves in a situation where there are no synagogues in walking distance. And now, in order to go to synagogue, they need to drive. So the conservative movement in the 1950s, in response to the growth of the suburbs, especially on Long Island, but throughout the country, said, okay, now we got a difficult situation. You're not supposed to drive on Shabbos. Starting the ignition creates an explosion in the engine. This is internal combustion. You're not allowed to create a fire on Shabbat. The answer is you're really not supposed to drive on Shabbos. But we've got people who can only get to a shul on Shabbos if they drive. There are no synagogues close by. What are we going to do? So conservative Judaism was backed into a corner. And they basically said, okay, if the choice is don't go to synagogue and don't drive, or the only way to get to synagogue is to drive, we will hereby allow Jews to drive in order to get to synagogue. So, of course, that becomes translated is conservative Judaism says you're allowed to drive on Shabbat. No, it doesn't say that. It says you're allowed to drive to the closest synagogue if that's the only way to get to a community on Shabbat to pray. Right? So ultimately, over the course of time, well, if we can drive, why can't we drive and go shopping? Why can't we drive and go visit, our family or our friends? After all, conservative Judaism said you're allowed to drive. So that was the debate and the controversy in the early 1950s. And within conservative Judaism, there is a small traditional core that said this was the ultimate mistake that the movement made, and that what we should have done at that point was to say, no, you can't drive on Shabbos. So what are the alternatives? People would have stopped coming to shuls, or they would have built a shul in their neighborhood, as people did in Temple Beth Torah, right? They initially built the shul in walking distance of the people in the neighborhood. It's only 20, 30 years later when the membership, moved out, not just to Westbury Hills, but to West Birchwood and then East Birchwood and then Brookville. Nobody's going to walk from Brookville to Temple Beth Torah on Yom Kippur. So after a while, people said, well, what's the difference between driving on Yom Kippur and driving on an ordinary Saturday? And as long as I could drive on an ordinary Saturday, right, what's the difference if I drive to my nephew's bar mitzvah, which may be in New Jersey? Okay, so there's a small core of traditional conservative Jews who said this was the undoing of conservative Judaism. That was the critical mistake that we made at the very beginning. And for the majority of conservative Jews, what's driving got to do with anything? Why can't I drive? How difficult it is it to get in the car, push the button, and go to where I want? Right? So that, to this very day, is a major issue within the conservative movement. So we'll leave it there with Rabbi Nehorai, and next week we'll pick up with Rabbi Yana. I'll see you then.